All right, well, welcome everyone. Let's see. Oh, hold on. I think I have to share my screen. Yep.
It's shared, Connie. We can see it.
So welcome everyone. So my name is Connie Pascal, and I am usually the instructor and the facilitator of Colloquium, but it is my great pleasure to turn those duties over to SCARLA, which is the Student College Academic and Research Library Association at Rutgers University, who were able to convince our special guest speaker to come and join us and spend some time with us tonight. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce the co-president of SCARLA, Jennifer Kaufman. Jennifer, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're so excited. I know that it's the end of the semester and it's just chaotic. And so I really appreciate everybody showing up tonight. And we're so excited to have Dr. Cook with us today. But before I introduce her, I'm going to go over the agenda and do a little housekeeping stuff. So first, to go over the agenda, Dr. Cook is going to give us a little information about her background, her research, and her teaching. And then we're just going to jump straight into discussion and conversation and a Q&A. And that's going to be moderated by Meredith Magenheim and I. And Meredith is also the co-president. She's my partner in crime. So she'll be doing a lot of the questions with me. And that brings me to kind of the details of the Q&A. So we're going to have 3 options for you guys to ask questions. So you can put your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you and you can ask via audio or video. And then also if you're wanting to ask something maybe a little bit more personal, you can go ahead and ask Victoria, who is our treasurer, but in the participants, you'll see that she's titled herself anonymous, and you can go ahead and put your question to her, and then she'll go ahead and ask it so you can maintain a little bit of anonymity if it's a very personal question. And then, let's see. Oh, and Caroline Mann, who is also, I think she's the secretary of SCARLA. She is going to be helping with technical issues, and she's the chat monitor. So if you run into any problems, let's say if you want to ask a question and you're having trouble unmuting yourself, then she can help you out with that. So I think with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Cook. All right, so Dr. Nicole Cook is a 3-time Rutgers alum, which is really cool. And she is the Augusta Baker Endowed Chair and Associate Professor of the School of Information Science in the University of South Carolina's College of Information and Communication. She has experience in public, medical, and academic libraries, and her research and teaching interests include critical cultural information studies, fake news, misinformation, disinformation, and diversity and social justice and librarianship, focusing on how to integrate them into LIS education and pedagogy. She has received many prestigious awards, including the 2016 ALA Equality Award, the 2017 ALA Achievement in Library Diversity Research Award, and the Association for Library and Information Science Education's 2019 Excellence in Teaching Award. So with that, Dr. Cook, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you. So thank you to Jennifer and Meredith and Marie and Ross for the invitation to join you tonight, and shout out to Betty and Gus and Joyce and Nancy. Always good to see you and good to be back. I was telling the ladies earlier, it's always interesting in a good way to come back. You know, you're sitting in a Zoom meeting with, you know, half of your committee and others of your professors, and it's you know, you become the student again. So it's interesting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, and, you know, please feel free to ask questions. You know, I know all this, so I tend to just kind of, you know, jump over things. As Jennifer mentioned, I am currently the Augusta Baker Endowed Chair at the University of South Carolina. and also an associate professor. And so in that particular job, I am doing a lot of outreach related to equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice. And I always mention Augusta Baker. She was a legendary children's librarian, Black librarian at the New York Public Library in the late 30s, 40s, 50s. So she had an amazing career at New York Public. And for every position that she reached, she was always either the first Black person or certainly the first Black woman to hold these roles. And by the time she retired, she was the head of children's services for all of the 80 plus branches of New York Public. And while she was at New York Public, she had an amazing influence on the children's literature field. The publishers, she wrote one of the first bibliographies to say, you know, I don't think that you are representing our Black children positively in the books that we're supposed to be using in our libraries, and I'm going to create a list that tries to rectify that. So she was very much known for that. And of course, she was a master storyteller. And so after she retired from the New York Public Library, she came to the School of Information Science at South Carolina and was a storyteller in residence for almost 15 years prior to her death. And so when I was offered the job, and I, you know, tell my director, David Lankus, this all the time, he said, you know, I want to talk to you about this Augusta Baker endowed chair. And I told him no. You know, I knew enough about Augusta Baker that I didn't want to touch that. You know, she was a legend. She was a children's librarian, and she just did a lot of things that I don't consider within my repertoire per se. And he said, no, he said, we want a librarian in the position, and we want someone that is able to concentrate on the equity, diversity, and inclusion part of her work. You know, she's obviously very much known for her wonderful work in children's literature, but she was a trailblazer for Black librarianship, and that's what South Carolina wanted to represent this time around. So I went. It's called a famously hot Columbia for a good reason. I'm not too happy about that part, but everything else is going really well. So before that, I was at the University of Illinois. And prior to that, I was finishing up my degree there at Rutgers. And I had been an academic librarian at Montclair State for, I guess, almost 10 years at that point, and, you know, had other stints in other libraries. So was definitely a practicing librarian for many years before becoming faculty. And so, and I guess I'm going backwards, but as Jennifer mentioned, I am a 3-time alum. I actually started Rutgers as an undergrad going into the College of Pharmacy, which, you know, anyone who knows me well is like, what? Yeah, that was an interesting detour. I thought that I knew enough math and science to make that happen, and it only took a semester to figure out that that wasn't going to work. And so I actually changed majors. I became a communications major, so I have almost the full sky experience, and I went right into the library science program directly from undergrad, and then I went to work, and then I came back for the PhD in 2008. So back to Illinois. I was hired at Illinois shortly before I graduated, and I was going to Illinois to teach about public services. So reference, instruction, that was what I did at Montclair State. And that's what I was doing for maybe the first semester and some change. And if for folks who've never been to Illinois, Champaign-Urbana is about 2.5 hours south of Chicago. And so it is literally in the middle of a cornfield. Not the most diverse place in the world, lovely place, but not especially diverse. And I had students coming up to me, white students, who would say, I have never had a professor ever who has not looked like me, right? So again, we're in graduate school and we're talking about, you know, 20 and up, saying that they've never seen anyone of color in the front of a classroom. And so that was interesting. It was amazing in some ways, because at this point it's 2012, right? And so I would say 95% of the time that was a great experience, and I learned from them, they learned from me. I did have one or two students who were, lack of a better word, they were a little feisty about it. They did not think that I should be the authority. They did not think that I should be giving them grades. And I had one woman in particular. Um, yeah, it's a wonder I didn't lose my job that first semester, because she was really pretty combative. So I say all this to say, I won that particular battle and kept my job. And I decided that if she and others could not deal with me as a woman of color in a library science program at the graduate level, that I and the school that I was working for at the time, we would essentially be guilty of malpractice if we sent them out into the field. Because our communities are entirely too diverse, and if they can't deal with me, I couldn't imagine what was going to happen when they got into these very diverse communities. And I had a lot of students who said, well, I'm going to go back home and be the town librarian, which is wonderful, but all 80 of you can't do that, right? So someone's going to wind up at New York Public. Someone's going to wind up at Philadelphia Free. Someone's going to wind up at Enoch Pratt. And I am purposely mentioning very large, diverse systems, right? And if they can't function, our communities are going to be the ones that suffer. So with that said, at the time at Illinois, there were no classes or course content related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. There was a 8-week class that in social justice that a previous doctoral student had created, but had not been taught since he left. So there, you're saying about maybe 10 years before I got there. And so for all intents and purposes, there was no diversity content. So I was fortunate that I was essentially able to exploit a gap in the curriculum. And the associate dean that I had at the time, I said, can I create this class? And she said, if you want to. In hindsight, I don't know that she thought I was going to do anything with it. And then 3-4 classes later, I guess she figured out that that's what I meant to do. So the class that I created was called Information Services to Diverse Populations. That is also the name of the book that I wrote in 2016. So it's kind of like chicken and egg. The book came out of the class came out of the book. And really just talking about cultural competence and talking about this critical self-reflection and this work that we have to do as people in order to work with our communities, right? So we are now in yet another phase where diversity is trendy, and a lot of people are jumping on the bandwagon. There might be some grants involved, there might be some conferences involved, and I've been doing this work for 20 years. I remember 20 plus at this point. I remember someone asking me at a conference, well, what are you going to do when this isn't trendy anymore? Keep doing what I'm doing. It's not trendy for me, right? I live this. And so, that's the work that I was doing. And in the meantime, I resurrected the social justice class, and I kind of rehabbed that a little bit. There was also another course called Race, Gender, and Sexuality that again had been created and maybe taught once, I think, by a doctoral student that was long gone. So I pulled that out, and I had to regularize all of these courses. And by regularize, meaning that I had to put all this paperwork in, I had to teach each class 3 times and then put the paperwork in. So I did a fair amount of work to kind of innovate in the curriculum. And so hopefully those classes are still being taught at Illinois, but they are certainly being taught at South Carolina. So, that is part of what my director brought me to South Carolina to do. And he has been very true to his word and has let me bring these courses with me. South Carolina had a class called Diversity in Libraries. I didn't have to kind of recreate that wheel. What I did was collapse the social justice and the race, gender, and sexuality course and kind of fill it out a little bit. So this semester, this is the first time I'm teaching it there, and I'm calling it Critical Cultural Information Studies. And then the other class I'm teaching this semester is just a brand new class. It's storytelling for social justice. And so it kind of brings my background in social justice and is trying to give a nod to Augusta Baker and her storytelling prowess. So that's what I'm doing at South Carolina, in addition to just a lot of outreach, just trying to really figure out how to make social justice the norm, in the curriculum. South Carolina also focuses a lot on what we call community literacy. I think other places may call it community engagement or community informatics, but just, how are we getting out there in the community? So as information professionals, we should never be going into our community saying, we're the experts and we're going to tell you exactly, what you should be doing. No, we are never going to be the experts in their experience, right? So if we are looking at this from a social justice lens, from an equity lens, now we're looking at things, we're labeling it the anti-racism lens. We should be talking to our communities and kind of co-creating that experience. What do they want to see? What do they need, right? And really kind of being collaborative about that process. So just a couple of things as part of the Baker Chair work. I have established an annual lecture. So this spring, April 2021, will be our second Augusta Baker lecture. Spring 2021 will also be the second spring semester where we've had the Baker Diversity Lecture Series. So it's a session not unlike this, and I'm bringing people in from the field that are doing EDI and social justice work, and just, we're just having a conversation. So we're doing a lot of work that benefits the school, the campus community, and hopefully the profession at large. I said that when I got to South Carolina, I wanted my program to be a destination of sorts for folks that want to do equity, diversity, and inclusion work. Betty will be thrilled to know that I've gotten them to commit to bringing in more Spectrum scholars and funding them. So I'm working on that. I am also working with ALA to resurrect the Spectrum Doctoral Fellowship Program, which Marie typed in the chat. I was a Spectrum Doctoral Fellow when I was at Rutgers, and I always give them so much credit for funding that degree and, allowing me to do this work that I've been doing. And so, yeah, that's and then research-wise, I certainly do research in this area. I'm working on some things related to social justice, obviously. I'm also still working with fake news, misinformation, and disinformation. And it's interesting because, I'd been doing this work as an instruction librarian for, 10 plus years before this became a thing. And a reporter called me at Illinois and said, well, I want to talk to you about fake news. And I was like, well, why do you want to talk to me? So I give that reporter credit for making that link. I think maybe even before I made the link between information literacy instruction and the instruction that we need to do around misinformation and disinformation. And so then finally, research-wise, I'm trying to bring my two areas together a little bit and really think about how misinformation and disinformation can be racialized and how we can really fight back against that. And, we've got alternately horrible and great examples of the COVID pandemic and how, people of color are inordinately affected by this virus, and then also they're the ones going to work and can't work from home, and then also the stereotypes and things, the misinformation that's happening that really could cost people their lives. So social justice in a variety of different ways, shapes and forms, and yeah, just keeping busy. So, as was mentioned at the top, I appreciate everyone coming out tonight. I know it is the end of the semester. It is also the end of the semester for me. And looking forward to a little bit of a break, but the work always continues. So with that in mind, I am happy to go into the question and answers. And then if there's something specific you want to know, please feel free to ask.
Thank you so much. So yeah, we will go ahead and type in the chat. We'll also be looking for raised hands. Anybody?
In the meantime, while people are thinking of questions to ask, I kind of have a question because I really love that a lot of your research focuses around how to integrate social justice into curriculum in graduate programs like the one we're in. And I think that's such an important issue. And even you touched on too that, you know, right now diversity is trendy, but what happens when it's not trendy anymore? And I'm kind of curious what you think can be done on this graduate level as professors, as students, as alumni to kind of like keep that momentum going and kind of keep that focus on making sure this doesn't just phase out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And it can also be, I think, a difficult question in that, you know, there's just a lot that goes on behind the scenes in terms of curriculum and what we need to do and what we need to cover, what we're accredited for, and things of that nature. So we always have that balance, right? So while I have been very fortunate to be able to kind of create these very topic specific courses, I am always running around behind the scenes trying to get this same content included in every class, right? And in a very natural way, hopefully, and not this kind of, oh, well, today we'll have an after school special and we'll talk about diversity for 10 minutes once a semester. That's not what I'm going for. And so it is, it's a level of education not only for the students, but also with my other faculty members, in the sense that, you know, sometimes people feel like, well, that's not my area and I don't feel qualified to teach it, or I don't want to have that conversation, or, you know, what have you. And so when I talk to my colleagues in particular, I say, is there a way that, you know, is comfortable for you, that we can also kind of just kind of naturally insert it, right? Because we want to normalize this equity and social justice lens, as opposed to having it be this thing, you know. I had a former administrator who is a data scientist, and he said, well, you know, I can't do all that stuff that you do. And he said, you know, we can't do diversity, you know, if we're teaching calculus, and, you know, that's different than what you do. And I said to him, you know, think about your syllabus. Are there any books or articles on your syllabus that aren't written by white men? And I mean, you could actually see the wheels moving, like he had never considered this. And I said, so what I'm saying is about trying to integrate across the curriculum is, are there women or other people of color who have written data science articles that you could put on your syllabus? And that was kind of like the click for that he needed. And he said, oh, I said, that's all I'm asking for, right? Just to try and incorporate some diverse perspectives and diverse voices. I'm not saying that you have to have like a whole unit. It would be nice, but you know, if that's not what you're comfortable with, if that's not what your course permits, there are some base level things that we can do. And I think that's the type of small action that will allow us to kind of keep this at the forefront of our pedagogy and our classes after, you know, kind of the pendulum has swung back to this not being trendy.
So I think I will call on Betty and Gus. You guys have your hands raised, it looks like.
Article addressing
Hi.
anti-racism. Give us some specifics on how and when to ensure that anti-racism is a major part of the curriculum for library science master's students by 2021.
Oh, I was hoping Betty, hoping Betty would say like 2022 or 23, like give me a minute.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and Betty and Gus and I talk about this all the time. You know, again, I'm fortunate I can talk about whatever I want in my classes. We are kind of riding this anti-racism wave. And I think just the word racism, even if it's, you know, combined with anti, scares some folks, and they're going to shy away from it in a way that they don't shy away from diversity, right? And so we also have a language issue, right? So it used to be multiculturalism, but multiculturalism has become so watered down, it almost doesn't mean anything. And to a certain extent, diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice, they become these very fuzzy things, and then they become mainstream. Like intersectionality doesn't mean what it right now, it does not mean what Kimberly Crenshaw intended for it to mean, right? So we're going to have the same issue with anti-racism. So we have to have those conversations about what it means and what it means for the curriculum. And I think, again, it's going to come down to those very small actions and those small moments of how we can have these honest conversations and how we can inject it into pedagogy across the board in a way that's not going to say, well, Nicole's a diversity person, so she should teach that. Or I don't know how to have this conversation. I had a colleague years ago tell me, I don't do that stuff. So you do that stuff, right? So it very much is going to be more education and conversation amongst the library faculty. So I did, I created and implemented an equity, diversity, and inclusion track at the recent ACES conference. I typically have some type of program at the Elise conference, and that's where a lot of our faculty are. And so just, really chipping away. But to Betty's point, I think that more needs to be done. If we're going to have this be a regular part of the curriculum in the next 3 or 4 years. Not exactly sure what that is yet. I will say another thing is that we need to work on is having more faculty of color. And having more faculty for whom this is their life, their interest, because then it gets down to what I said before. You have to have the metadata class, you have to have the reference class. There are certain basic things that we have to have, and then you run into a personnel issue, right? So who's going to teach this and who's going to teach that? So we certainly do need to make sure that we recruit and retain I would say quite a few more faculty of color, which also brings me back to the Spectrum Doctoral Fellowship, because that pipeline is unfortunately starting to dry up a little bit. So we need to get some more doctoral students. Hint, hint, anyone on the call want to talk to me about doctoral studies, let me know. But it's part of like this whole ecosystem, this whole kind of cycle, and it's hard to say which one is more important than others, the other, because they all work together to really kind of build up this critical mass where we can have these conversations where someone is not going to get defensive, or someone's going to say, I don't know how to talk about that and I don't want to talk about it. So it is certainly still a work in progress, and hopefully we'll be able to do even more in that direction in the next couple of years.
I think that's so interesting, like the diversity of perspectives and all the diversity within the diversity of perspective, kind of bringing that all together is such an important thing. And we're going to take a question really quickly from Lynn from the chat. She's curious, what has been your biggest challenge when battling mis-disinformation?
Yeah, so a lot of my work thus far has really been about the emotional dimension of misinformation and disinformation. And we could have conversations, we could have classes, I could tell you all of the different strategies, and I could tell you all the tips and tricks and techniques of how to find quality information and how to combat misinformation. But a lot of this is going to come down to our emotional reactions and our emotional attachments to particular people and to particular sources, right? So for example, Ross could say something to me and give me a set of facts. And if I don't like Ross, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. So if I don't trust Ross as a source, or if I have some particular bug that day that I don't want to pay attention, then Ross is going to be blue in the face trying to get me to believe a particular fact, right? Whereas if Connie says something that's completely off the wall, but I trust Connie as a source, I'm going to believe that misinformation, right? So, you could have all of the skill set skill sets that you need, but we're always going to go kind of revert back to that base emotional reaction. And I think that for me is the biggest thing in battling misinformation and disinformation. And, another thing that I'm sure you're all aware of at the moment is that information becomes very politicized. And so someone says, I don't want to read the New York Times, or I don't want to read this particular source. And so you try and go around that and say, well, can you triangulate the piece of information that you heard? Like, I don't care where you get it from. Did you see it more than once? So we can get a little traction that way. Um, but it still could just be all, it could just be all thrown away if someone has a particular emotional reaction. So I think that's the hardest part about trying to navigate this particular landscape.
It's almost more like the psychology of it all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
So I think we have an anonymous question, and then Professor Todd, we did see your hand raised, so you'll be next after our anonymous question. Victoria, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, so we have an anonymous question. It says, looking ahead, do you think that the pandemic has revealed racial disparities that have a better chance of being addressed in the years to come?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I think the pandemic has laid us bare in a lot of different ways. And so these inequities were there. And now we've got, just the brightest of all bright lights shined on these inequities. I hope that these are things that we'll be able to address. And I think that these particular inequities that have been really just kind of exposed go beyond this idea of them being trendy. But now we have to get the resources, and now we have to keep the momentum up. So there is a little bit of trend related to it. And let me give you an example. There is a great article by lithub.com, maybe about 2 weeks ago, and it was written by a bookseller. And the title was something along the lines of, let me talk to you about this anti-racism, I'm losing my words, the anti-racism books that everyone wanted to read over the summer, right? And so these books that have been in existence for many years suddenly were on the bestsellers list. Everyone wanted to read Ibram X. Kendi. Everyone wanted to read Robin DiAngelo. And then they read the books and then they stopped, right? And so, I've done some other writing in Publishers Weekly about, reading is only the first step. What are you going to do with this information that you've received from these books? Are you going to turn it into action? And I think that's going to be the hard part, getting people to kind of capitalize on that momentum and that excitement. And yes, thank you, Connie. That is the title of the article. How do we get people to capitalize on this momentum to actually do something? And if we can get enough people to the point where they want to act on it, then I think we could have a really good chance of addressing some of these inequities. But if some of this remains performative, like the article mentioned, some people really just wanted to take pictures with the anti-racism books that they bought and post their shelfies. If we can't get people past the shelfie part, then we're going to wind up, in the same boat that we're in with these inequities.
Yeah, I agree. It's going to be very interesting to see the aftermath of this and that continuation. And
yeah. And it's been interesting. And I'll give you another anecdote. So there are several faculty of color that I talk to just about every day. And we write together, we do presentations together. And in 2016, when Trayvon Martin was killed, we started doing presentations, and we have t-shirts that have information on the front and on the back. They have Black Lives Matter in library and information science. When those t-shirts came out, there were several people who were not amused with us and were very vocal in telling us how inappropriate these shirts were and how inappropriate our presentations were. And so now, let's fast forward to 2020 and George Floyd has died. I put the t-shirts up again and raised $5,000 for the Southern Poverty Law Center. Same shirt, right? So again, it's kind of that trend, that pendulum. But if I can keep everybody in those shirts, we might be able to make some progress going forward. It's just interesting, what the new awakening becomes, and maybe hopefully we can keep some people awake to these inequities.
Yeah, I agree. Professor Todd, did you want to ask your question?
I'll do it. First of all, Nicole, what a joy to see you. And just on behalf of us all, thank you for your intellect and your insight and your vision and your action. One of the things that I see as I scan the various, LIS communities, I kind of see almost this tokenistic reaction. And I see it coming through in a number of ways. The call for a special issue of a journal, all led by white men or white women. I see these kind of one-off 2-hour webinars or sessions. And in some ways I sense the well-meaning of that, but I also feel as if this is not sustainable. How do you, and probably it's more of a rhetorical question, how do you move beyond that sense of tokenism within the broader LIS community to build that commitment to sustained action and to sustained change?
Yeah, and Ross and Marie and Betty and Gus know that this is my career's work, right? So I'm used to this, and so I and the folks that are in my tight network that do this work, we just keep doing the work. So we do what I call slamming the boards, and slamming the boards is an old used to be for virtual reference and things of that nature. And you would just kind of, get on, all the librarians would get on and answer questions. And so the way I'm using it is when you have different conferences and different calls for proposals, slam the boards and slam the organizers with proposals that have to do with all things equity, diversity, and inclusion. And by that, I'm saying, integrate it into what you're doing it, right? Don't make it like, this special issue type thing that they feel like they can't touch. But this idea of normalizing these conversations to the point where it's easy for them to reject me as an individual, but if all 40 of us submit, they can't reject, well, they could, but it'll be much harder to reject all 40 of us, right? So just to kind of keep this momentum going and this conversation going. And, but there have been times where my network and I have had to kind of say gently correct. Because sometimes I think, also when the topic becomes trendy, and if folks come through that don't know enough about the topic and perhaps don't have the right motivations. Like, I'm not saying they're being malicious, but they may not have the right motivation. They can actually do some harm. And so then when the pendulum swings, those of us who have been doing the work wind up doing a little bit of cleanup, and then try to move forward. I had a student once that told me, well, I'm taking your class because they told me it would be marketable to take a class with you. Okay, that's nice, but if you're not ready to have this conversation, you and I are both going to have a really difficult semester. And so, we want folks to do this work for the right reasons, because they feel it in their soul, and they, this is kind of where their moral compass leads them and where their heart leads them, and not because it's marketable or because it'll look good if they took a class with a particular person and things of that nature. So, to Ross's point, we have this, we get this glut on the market, if you will. And sometimes that can muddy the waters. But I think it is also a good opportunity for those who, do the work all the time to kind of come in and say, yes, this is great. And have you also thought about this? And have you thought about, this conference? Have you thought about this topic? This is a great time to recruit students, particularly at the PhD level, who want to do research in the area. So there's good in it, right? We just have to kind of cut through some of the noise, if you will. Not all of it's bad noise, but just there's a lot. Like, I'm webinared out. I'm with you on that. So we just have to make a way. And I think, those of us who do this work on a regular basis, I just had a webinar maybe about 2 weeks ago. And it just, it was me talking to my community. And in this case, it was practitioners on social media, Twitter in particular. And it was a young black librarian. And she said, I really wish the field knew XYZ about librarians of color. And I said, okay, let's do a webinar on it. And we had about 300 people sit there for 2 hours listening to this panel of, just really brilliant black librarians talking very candidly about their experience. So I think people do know how to cut through some of the noise. And I think this is a good opportunity for those who want to get started and get involved. There's so much to choose from. Hopefully they can find, the right path to get them where they need to be to really do this work and be able to do this work beyond the trend.
Wonderful, thanks.
So our next question, I'm gonna ask, but then I'm also gonna kind of add on for myself because I feel this very strongly personally as well. So Laura asks, how do you recommend students respectfully and effectively advocate for change within our classrooms? And, like I said, this is personal for me. It can feel like we have very little control or responsibility, or power, I guess you could say, to really, we're graduate students, and I'm a graduate assistant in the libraries at Rutgers. So when you're kind of at that low level, kind of low on the totem pole, what are some suggestions of things that we can still do?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I always tell my students, particularly the ones that are working, while they're in class, I said, I'm not trying to get you fired. So you'll never be able to go say, Dr. Cook told me XYZ, and then you get fired. Like, that's not my goal. And this is going to probably come up again in your professional positions post graduation, right? I always tell students, you can be the most culturally competent, the most socially just, the most socially aware, and do amazing work. And you could work for an organization that just isn't interested. And so then how do you navigate that? And so, and I did it, right? I've had positions as a librarian, perhaps even as a faculty member early on, where I was perhaps the only one or one of very few. And you just kind of have to find your people, even if you can't make a stand right then and there in the classroom. Now, I will say that I am a fan of calculated risk. And you have to weigh the pros and the cons, and you have to decide, just what are the consequences that could happen if you kind of push the envelope in a classroom, in your job. There are a lot of situations where the worst you could hear is no, or the situation better than anyone else, and know whether those consequences could be more significant and whether you can live with them, right? And then you just have to decide, right? I am also kind of the mind that you kind of have to pick your battles, right? Because this can be very difficult work. And there's a larger context and ecosystem happening. And if you pick every battle, you're not going to have anything left. So I'm giving you a lot of cliches, but these are things that I tell myself. And even in the position that I'm in, I pick my battles, right? I'm not I'm not in the director's office every day with something, right? Because I won't get anything done. But I think what I would leave you with for this particular question is, try it, right? But also go with a solution. Don't just go with a complaint and just say, I noticed in this particular unit that we covered X, Y, and Z, but I read this really interesting piece by Elfrida Chapman, or someone else. Is it something that I can incorporate or something that I could mention to the class? And just kind of bring it up a little bit as you can. I think part of the key is making it relevant to others, and not just yourself, because then it's going to be easy for them to say, Jennifer, that's just, you and your pet project again. How are we making it relevant to the whole? And so I'm not saying that this is completely easy, but that is a way to do it. And then when I worked, and I will freely say, I did a lot of wonderful work at Montclair State. It was not an environment that was particularly conducive to equity, diversity, and inclusion work. And just as a side note, I just spoke at a conference they were doing on Black Lives Matter. I was like, I don't know who you people are. It was like 10 years later. So, organizations can change, right? I'll put it that way. But when I felt like I couldn't get any traction in that particular position, I would go to the conference that the Black Caucus of the American Library Association put on. There were several Black librarians in New Jersey. We started a chapter of the Black Caucus in New Jersey. And if it weren't for those 4 or 5 people, I don't know that I would have gotten through some of the professional hurdles, just because there weren't enough people, there weren't enough like minds. So you have to kind of find that path, even if it's outside of your current classroom or your current position. So I don't know if I answered your question. I'm not purposely talking around it, but it is difficult. If you don't have enough like minds around you that really want to do the work.
No, that's definitely helpful, just in the mentality of thinking it through.
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to address some things. I'm going to keep it vague on purpose, but I once had a colleague basically say, you can't address this, like, let's say, for example, social justice for BIPOC individuals, because then you would have to tackle all of these other things. Like, then for this social group, you would have to do this, and how do you?
Well, so some of this, and I'm sure is just not factually correct. All right, so sometimes you got to hit people with, no, that's just not true, and you have to be able to back it up. But I think this is because I still get the same type of comments, like, this is not a zero-sum game, right? So if I am creating signage or programming for one particular community, it doesn't mean that I'm taking anything away from another community, right? And so we have to, figure out how to change that mindset. And again, I think some of this is factual, right? And then, you can hit them with, well, let's do a community analysis and find out who exactly is in our community. And then we have to figure out how we're going to prioritize our resources. Now, you can go back to them with the library jargon. Like, I can do that all day. But I think some of that is removing the emotion from it, or at least letting them think you're removing the emotion from it, and go back to them with, okay, well, then let's do it this way, and just try a different approach, because it's very much that, well, we've always done it this way, and people are very reliant on stereotypes and what they think is happening, and you have to figure out a way to say, actually, that's not who our community is. And actually, it's been proven in the literature to say X, Y, and Z. So you may get a little bit more traction that way.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Mhm.
We do have two more questions in the chat. I want to be respectful of your time too. One, Megan has one, but I kind of want to come back to it because James' question kind of goes into what you've just been talking about a
Okay.
little bit. And he is saying that he's having a little bit of, he sometimes struggles with getting past the choir. It's easy to preach to the choir, but how do we talk to people who do not get it? How do we get people to do more than just nod and agree and get out there and challenge racist myopia?
Yeah. Um, the short answer is sometimes you're just not going to be able to recruit new people to the choir. And that is a hard lesson. It doesn't mean that you quit trying, but just kind of the realization that everyone doesn't think the way you do, right? And it's hard, because I do programs too where the same people come, and we have great conversations, but how do we get other people involved? And I think for me, at least, it gets back to how am I trying to make this relevant to other people? Is there a way that I can talk about social justice and, focus on the food pantry on campus, right? Because someone could be like, that could be their passion is food insecurity and housing insecurity, but they don't necessarily think of it as social justice, right? And how do we merge our interests with theirs to, kind of bring them together and let people see that this is the work that they're doing too. And just, going out into, different contexts and different environments. I've gone to different conferences and I've talked about, let's say, information behavior and pulled a little discussion about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and gotten people to say, oh, I never thought about it that way. Some people need a softer touch. And like I was saying to Jennifer, you might have to go a little bit harder with just, some of the facts and things of that nature. But I have encountered people who have taken my class and come out on the other side and still just don't get it. It's kind of like the fake news I was telling you earlier about, just, kind of that emotional reaction and just, they're just not into it. So it's not the best response or not the best answer, but for me, it did take a lot of the pressure off, to then I could focus on the people and the communities that I knew wanted to do the work and wanted to do better. Um, and I think that's where the consistency comes in. I've had other people see me do this work consistently, even when it's not trendy. And sometimes people will come around that way because they can, actually be able to identify this is an important issue that she's been working on for like 20 years. So yeah, let me see. It's James, I'm sorry not to have a better kind of more packaged answer for you. But yeah, you're always going to encounter those people, and getting non-choir members is definitely a challenge.
I think that's the kind of hard truth to swallow sometimes. That, of course, you want to be able to change everybody's mind, but you're right. Realistically, you kind of have to, like you even said earlier, pick your battles. And
yeah,
okay.
Well, it's like that woman I told you about, that was consistently challenging me in my classroom. If I were to find her today, I'm willing to wager money that she still doesn't care anything about EDI work. But I bet she might have a little bit more respect for me as an instructor, right? So sometimes it's like small steps and, small changes, and you take what you can get sometimes.
Yeah. I think we'll just do the one last question from Megan. She was asking, what are some strategies and best practices or ideas for diverse recruitment and retention in academia?
Yeah, I am actually more a proponent of retention discussions. I think if you have enough money, the recruitment is actually not the hard part. Right now, certainly, money is an issue. And like I said to you before, if not for the Spectrum Doctoral Fellowship, probably would not have gotten the PhD. So that certainly is an issue. And, when we're talking about recruitment, there are things to think about like cohort models, cluster hires, and other things to kind of bring in a little bit of community, right? Because, I've been a diversity hire, right? And I've used that to my advantage, but I've met other diversity hires who that made them feel a little isolated. And so, it's hard to do this work in isolation. And if you just kind of retreat into that, this is one of the reasons that we lose people. So if there's some type of programmatic balance or some type of programmatic incentive, including community, I think that is also always benefits recruitment and retention. And in terms of retention, I think, we really need to be thinking and talking very directly about our organizational cultures, right? I'm running a search now for South Carolina, and they are asking candidates to submit a diversity statement. Now, I'm not a huge fan, only because I think that sometimes the search committees aren't trained. And so that's one thing we need to work on as well. And so if the search committee is not trained, then they don't know what to do with the diversity statements, right? And then we have an implicit bias problem that is documented about search committees. We have other literature that says that people tend to hire people that look like them, right? Because they're always, organizational culture is very much concerned with fit, right? And fit can be a very loaded and coded word, right? So this idea of trying to really just have these conversations to unpack all of these things in advance, I think that can go a long way for the recruitment and retention process. And when folks get there, we have to continue these conversations. So if someone says, someone microaggressed me in the hallway, we can't have administration say, oh, that's okay, just ignore it, right? Maybe we need to have a conversation about it. Maybe we need to have a meeting that says, well, let's talk about how we're going to be respectful to all of our colleagues. And then there has to be some accountability. And some repercussions if this keeps happening. So again, it's kind of that larger ecosystem. But I think all of those things really go into this long-term success of recruitment and retention.
I guess one last thing, maybe before turning over to Dr. Radford for closing remarks, maybe just end on a kind of fun high note of what are you most excited about or looking forward to in the future of librarianship with kind of like that social justice focus?
Yeah. So for me, I got into archival work. Nothing I ever thought about when I was doing my PhD work. So one thing would be never be afraid to try new things. And I am trying to find grant money so I can digitize the papers and the effects of Augusta Baker. And I literally love digging through these dirty boxes, just trying to uncover stories and things of that nature. So with that said, to your question, I'm excited about unearthing the stories about our profession that we don't already know.
That's a really incredible answer. So Marie, I guess we'll turn it over to you for last remarks, but I just want to say thank you, Dr. Cook, for all of your wisdom and helping bring a little bit of sanity. I know, for some of us, it can get very wound tight, and it's nice to just remember that we're playing the long game here, right?
And that is the exact phrase. Yes. Yep.
That's great. Thank you so much, because that kind of leads right into what I was going to leads right into some of my remarks. And this is all strictly just off the cuff, and I'm not going to make long remarks because we have given our time over, as was our vision and the students' vision, to Nicole today. And I wanted to just congratulate our Scarlet officers first. I'm going to start there, Nicole, because these officers instructors. So Jennifer, Meredith, Victoria, and Caroline, we've been working on this program for a while now, and they had come to me with this idea of bringing you here. And at first I said, Nicole is one of the busiest people that I know. And, it was coming on the heels of Elise and then ASIST. And I put in the comments that I saw what you did with your Slam the Boards. I went to as many programs as I could. They were amazing, really inspirational, and helping me also to work through some of the things that I'm thinking about, as far as all of this. One thing was the I3 consortium, which is taking young people who are undergraduates and trying to give them a leg up on what it means to be in research and to then move forward through that. And Connie knows a lot about this. She's been very active in I3, and our colleague Joe Sanchez, who I know was involved with you, Nicole, in kind of creating some of that stuff with ASIST. Joe had come to me when he was on our faculty and said, Marie, we have to do more with I3, and really introduced me to the idea of it. And we've been very, very supportive, and we're intending to do more in that area, because this is the pipeline. It's not there unless you start to create it. And the students were asking about the pipeline. Well, it's the same thing also with librarianship and bringing in diverse people to the library. Early in my career, I was invited to speak at Queensborough Public Library when they had the PAGE program. They were taking young people who were pages in the library. They were introducing them to library leaders like myself, who came and talked to them about why they might want to consider librarianship as a career, and those kinds of things. Somebody who's 14, 15, 16 years old, but maybe no one ever said to them before, oh, you're working in the library, but what about that as a career, and thinking about it. So you're kind of starting to grow people early on, and the same has to happen for the research community. If people aren't interested in research, and a lot of times the very best and the brightest, the golden handcuffs, right? They can get a job that pays a lot more than being a librarian with their brains and their initiative and all this. So, that's part of the thing. But I just want to say that, this group of students persevered, and they reached out to Nicole, and, Ross and I both encouraged them to do this and say, ask her. Well, she could only say no, right? So we're really happy that you said yes. But Nicole, what I want to say to you is that you also came on your own terms, which I love that. Nicole said, I'm not giving this speech where you guys are just going to sit and I'm going to be the sage on the stage. I want to have a real conversation with these students, right? And we're all like, sure, we'll make this happen. And then Connie, who runs the MI Colloquium, we said, Connie, Nicole wants a conversation. She doesn't want to just talk at us. And I'm just really also all proud of you, audience, who showed up, and the students. This is the quality of the students that we have, Nicole, because you were one, that we just have the most amazing students you're really all about it, and we're really very interested in this idea. We do have, we have learned a lot from you, Nicole, and Ross and I and Betty and those of us who have been, Nancy, who have been really privileged to work with you, all along in our engagement with you. We have learned so much from you. There's so much to think about. We're at a moment here. I am very actually hopeful about this moment, despite this horrible summer with the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all the others, and all of the pain and agony and grief that added to our already grieving communities who were grief-stricken, over, COVID, and how it's been, really impacting members of our minority communities much more harder hit, and many more deaths in that community as well. But now we have, I think we're at a political moment. As you said, bright lights have been shining like all over a whole lot of stuff recently, right? That's kind of said to us, we really have to make some change. And maybe some people who weren't getting it before, look at the Black Lives Matter movement, where people were standing shoulder to shoulder who had never really got that before, this idea of what does it mean to say that Black Lives Matter, that it's not just a slogan and so forth. I love what you had to say, Nicole, about having difficult conversations, saying to someone, well, that's not true, or insisting if there is, and I know that you've endured a lot. I know that you've endured a lot of, talk about microaggressions and microaggressive behavior and so forth like that, which it's very kind of difficult for people to understand unless it happens to them. And then they recognize it right away, right? So when you're treated rudely because of some aspect of your identity, whether it's because you're a young person or because you're a woman or you're LGBTQ or whatever it is about your identity, that then people, and you realize that's why someone's being rude to you. In that moment, that's when you actually get what that means. So, I think another hopeful thing is that there's so much more engagement with communities, and you were talking about this as well. And I know Nancy Chronic and Betty and all of us have been working on this kind of topic for years, but really actually opening up and listening and establishing better relationships with our community members. And we all can do that in our all various and very little ways, right? We can all kind of contribute to that and to invite more people into the conversation and lift up their voices. And I think that's really the most important thing. So, it's so delightful. So much, you've given us so much to think about again tonight. I'm really very appreciative of you, Nicole, all of your work and your willingness to come and talk to us tonight. So thank you.
Thank you. It's always good to come home.
And I would just like to reiterate everything that Jenny, Professor Todd said earlier, that Dr. Radford just said. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight. We're so grateful for your wealth of knowledge and for continuing to inspire us with your work. You make it honestly an honor and an excitement to join the field of librarianship. And I'd also just like to really quickly thank Connie and MI Colloquium for all your help in putting this together and your expertise. I'd like to thank everybody that joined us and your really thoughtful questions and for making this such a thought-provoking conversation. I'd like to thank Dr. Radford, not only as Scarla advisor, but also as the chair of Library and Information Science, for always just encouraging us and supporting us. My fellow Scarla members too, Jenny and Victoria and Wafa, who couldn't be here, and Caroline, for all your hard work in making this happen. It's just been a really inspiring and thoughtful night tonight, and really good way to kind of close out the semester, I think.
Meredith, that was great. Wonderful. Thank you again to everyone. Nicole, wonderful as usual. Again, I echo everything else that everyone said. And with that, we're going to go ahead and close the evening out. So everyone have a wonderful evening and stay safe and stay thoughtful. This is a lot to think about. So take care, everyone. Bye-bye.